Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kirak Almasyan. Whether you agree with Saudi Arabia or you disagree, it is one of the most important players, if not the most important Arabic player in the region. And recently, Saudi Arabia has adopted a different approach toward the region, and with the mediation of China, Saudi Arabia and Iran, they struck a security deal and a diplomatic deal, which will definitely have a positive repercussion on the region and also especially in Syria, as our today's guest, Kamal Alam, argued in his latest article. He is an expert in contemporary military history of the Middle East. He was a fellow at the Royal United Services Institute between 2015 and 2019, and currently he is a fellow at the Institute for Statecraft and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he teaches at several military staff colleges across the Middle East. Mr. Alam, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for having me on your show, Kiva. Look forward to it.
Great pleasure. Actually, in March of this year, China brokered a deal to restore diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which aims at settling a long-standing bilateral dispute between the both important players. You argued in your recent article that President Assad is the immediate beneficiary of the Chinese-led initiative. Can you please elaborate on this, and why do you think Assad is one of the beneficiaries of this deal?
So I think one of the reasons the President Assad might be one of the beneficiaries of this deal is the general position of Syria over the last 2-3 years. I would say, and I've written about this, it started in 2018 when I think the real rapprochement started between various Gulf countries and Damascus. And also there was a slow and steady upsurge in Chinese interest in Syria. Of course, Chinese interest in Syria is very old, but I think in this war, in fact, I think Syria is the first war, China took a very active stance on the UN Security Council. So it became very important for them to support the Syrian government and also oppose regime change and American hegemony in the Levant. And overall, when we look at the Saudi-Iran rapprochement brokered by China, this is something that the Chinese have been working towards over the last 5-6 years with their increased economic diplomacy in the Middle East. I do not think China is interested in politics or war. They just want a regional economic connectivity. You know, their Silk Road project, which started way back in 2004, and even then, when the first contacts between Damascus and Beijing on the economic and cultural line started, this fits in very well because Syria is, of course, very fundamental to stability of Lebanon, Iraq, and China is interested in all these regions. So I think the first beneficiary becomes Damascus, and I think we're already seeing that with almost within a few days, the Saudi and Syrian official statement of renewing diplomatic relations, which again, something not overnight. It's been happening over the last 3-4 years. Saudi and Syrians have been meeting unofficially behind the scenes, and some more public visits by Syrian ministers to Saudi Arabia. Now it becomes formal. And I think China is a catalyst because new leadership in Saudi Arabia wants economic prosperity, and China does economic diplomacy rather than military diplomacy. And that's something that suits Syria very much at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I want to just jump in and say something for the followers. They asked me this question, like if the Syrians and the Saudis started to speak again in 2018, 2019, right, unofficially, why this hasn't been faster, the reconciliation. And I would say there was a phase of hostilities and then phase of negotiations and then settlement. Things, unfortunately, in politics, and especially in the Middle East, it doesn't happen quickly. And there are so many complexities and and so many files that they have to address. The presence
Yeah.
of the Iranians in Syria, the policy of Syria in the region. Of course, this has to be discussed, and it has been proven in the past decade, in my opinion, especially when there was a phase of hostilities between the Arab countries and Syria. Every time there is this hostility against Syria, Syria goes more into the side of Iran instead of being detached more from the Iranian side. So this would be beneficial for the region, because I myself, as a Syrian, I don't want Syria to be into any other sides. Syria's role in the region should be more balancing between different players than being embedded in one power than the another. But Assad was isolated in the past decade, and now he is re-emerging in the region, thanks to the Emirati diplomacy, and now the Saudis coming. Yesterday, the foreign minister of Syria was in Egypt. How do you explain the re-emergence of Assad on the diplomatic scene, despite US's pressure on the region to continue the policy of isolation of Damascus? Has the US lost its leverage in the Middle East, or the Middle Eastern players do not want to follow the American, if it's correct to say, dictates for them?
I think it's a mix of a couple of things. I think the original sin, as I call it, the original sin that the European powers and America made in the war in Syria was underestimating Syria's diplomatic relations. And despite the extreme wars and despite being taken out of the Arab League, Syria never stopped its relations with various Arab countries. I think at the top, of course, are Algeria, Egypt, and Oman. And then these were the official contacts that remained very strong. And of course, there was Iraq and the Egyptian support to Damascus throughout the war, even in the early days after the ouster of Hosni Mubarak. If you remember, the late Egyptian intelligence chief, Omar Suleiman, he was supportive of Damascus. And then Tantawi, the former head of the Egyptian army. So the Arab relations to Damascus never stopped. Of course, the Arab League relationship stopped. But if one were to be serious, the Arab League has never really been anything more than a talking shop in reality anyway. And behind the scenes, UAE never stopped their relationship. There were direct flights, you remember, going on, even Bahrain. Of course, Oman had official relations. What's happened over gradual years, I think the most hostile country, of course, was Qatar, with Qatar's regional role in supporting various Islamic groups from Afghanistan all the way to North and West Africa. And then once there was a leadership change in Saudi Arabia with the new crown prince and the new defense minister, Mohammed bin Salman, he then started realigning Saudi policy to Syria publicly as well. So as I said, the Syrians have always had very strong links behind the scenes. And of course, I forgot to mention Sudan was there as well. Even if you look at the Palestinian groups, way back in 2014, the PLO, Fatah, was sending delegations to Damascus. So the re-engagement of Syria had begun almost 2-3 years after the first shock of the war. It's now become overt and official. And this has also perhaps coincided with American failure in Syria and an overall American failure within the Middle East. Last week was the 20th anniversary of the Iraq invasion, and even in American media, people are asking, that one of the biggest mistakes or blunders of U.S. foreign policy has isolated America in the region, and other countries like Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries, they see other options, whether it's the reemergence of Russia as a Middle East power, the emergence of China, and also the role of India. India's also become a big player with Gulf, especially on the economic diplomacy. And the Democratic administration, both of Obama and Biden, they haven't helped themselves and isolate. The idea was to isolate Damascus, but they've isolated America as a superpower. Now they're multi-power emerging in the Middle East, and for that, America no longer is the final guarantor. It's still, of course, the big military power, no one can doubt that, but their influence in the Middle East severely diminishes as other countries take up their own policy. UAE have ignored all American threats, including of sanctions on engaging with Damascus. The Saudis were very blunt. We saw Mohammed bin Salman tell Atlantic magazine a couple of years ago. I don't care what Biden thinks. Again, we've seen the Saudis raise the oil price today. So the Saudis aren't going to be bullied by America. Not this current Saudi leadership. It's much more nationalistic, trying to move away from America as its patron.
One of the, also, in my opinion, the social aspect of the American policy in Syria is the presence of lots of influencers nowadays in the United States. I don't want to mention names, but there are so many that after the invasion of Ukraine or the Russian offensive on Ukraine, and because the American administration says that this is illegal, and they're asking now the question, then if this is illegal, then what are you doing in Syria? As if the Syrian case has resurfaced in the public discussion in the United States after the earthquake and after the Russian offensive on Ukraine. And now there is even, I've seen tens of thousands of people protesting in the United States under the protest name Rage Against the War Machine. And Syria was one of the main topics that all the speakers spoke to the audience, which was surprising because I thought the anti-war movement has demised in the United States, but then every time there is a different a war in different parts of the world, the Syrian file will resurface again, and more pressure will be put on the American administration. But if we go back to our topic, the Saudi Arabia now will restore diplomatic ties with Syria. The foreign minister of Saudi Arabia will most probably visit Damascus after Ramadan or during the Eid. And Riyadh, according to Reuters, will invite President Assad to the next Arab League summit. Do you think the Syrian opposition has been pushed under the bus? And was the Syrian opposition a player during this time, or it was used by different regional powers?
I think if you remember, I think in 2013, was it Muaz Khatib, the former head of the opposition, when he resigned as head of the Syrian opposition, saying that Turkey and Qatar have more control of this opposition, so it's less of a Syrian opposition, more of a foreign-controlled opposition. The Syrian opposition became irrelevant very quickly. They're relevant only in a few hotels in Doha, less so in Istanbul even. They're being squeezed in Turkey. They're very active in Washington, D.C. in the lobby. So they remain strong really far away. But when it comes to the actual geography, they've been irrelevant for a long time in terms of engaging with regional countries. And despite there were a lot of protests recently in Turkey about the Turkish rapprochement with Damascus, or the upcoming rapprochement potentially after the election. The Saudis never had much time for the Syrian opposition. For the last 3-4 years, they haven't engaged with them at all.
What about Qatar?
I would say Qatar is still very active. If you also look at Qatar's regional alignment and their public diplomacy, it's still very much against the Syrian government. I think they're the last remaining stumbling block in the Arab world, and it might change, but so far they haven't shown any signs of lessening their support to the Syrian opposition. In fact, they recently even introduced the Taliban to the Syrian opposition, and
I've
last
seen
year,
that photo. That was
yeah,
so hilarious.
and
The ambassador of Taliban and the
yeah,
Syrian
meeting the Syrian
opposition
opposition.
ambassador in Doha.
Yeah, and also there was a symposium in Idlib last year.
Mhm.
If you Google Idlib Symposium Taliban, that the Syrian opposition were like, what are the lessons learned from the Taliban? They took 20 years to come to power. Maybe we can wait as well.
Mhm.
So definitely Qatar is still behind those moves with regards to some of these groups that they support. And unlike the other Gulf countries, I think they've completely changed their policy. Some would say UAE was never in that full camp of Assad must go. They were always pragmatic. Oman was always neutral and pro Damascus, and even Bahrain. And the Saudis, I think, especially since King Abdullah, since his death and since King Salman came, they were quietly behind the scenes, always arguing, out trying to talk to Damascus. And it's more about Tehran. It's not about Damascus as far as the
Mhm.
Saudis go. And that's why the Chinese element could be interesting, because again, Saudi want the 2030 vision. They want peace in the region. They want just to get on and connect each other's economy. And so in that sense, China's role could be interesting, because China is only interested in the business aspect. I don't think China interferes in countries politically to who the president is or who the king is. They just want to do business in the region.
This is exactly the argument that I want to stress on, that it's the interest of Saudi Arabia and it's in the interest of China is
Yeah.
to restore peace and stability in the region, and also in Turkey, because Turkey wants to make itself an energy hub in the region. And if there is a destabilization in the region and animosity with Damascus, there could be destabilization inside Turkey itself. So for the pessimists, I'm just trying to say, like, this is in the interest of these countries
Yeah.
now, economic and financial interest, to strike deals also with Damascus and the rest of the region, and it is a good news for the region. At the end of the day, I always mention this to Joe. Joe is always better than to war, and diplomacy is the
Absolutely.
continuation of a war, but with different means. I don't understand, especially the people who are far away from the Middle East and encouraging more conflicts in the region. I don't understand that logic. Now, Saudi Arabia will invite Assad to attend the Arab League summit. I'm not sure if Assad will attend it or not. Probably the foreign minister of Syria will attend if they're invited. But this is a personal, like an aspect question. Do you think the MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and Assad personalities fit together and they can cooperate together in the region?
I think so. I mean, MBS is a young leader in his early to mid 30s, and in many ways, a lot of people look up to him. He's revolutionizing and changing Saudi Arabia very quickly. And of course, 20 years ago, if you remember, everyone in the world was talking about another young Arab leader, which was President Assad, and the reforms he was carrying out. People were writing about his wife, the first lady. Everyone wanted a picture with the first lady, and Syria was seen as reforming quickly. So I think, in that sense, their personalities will get on together, and I think it will be quite natural for them to get along if the desire was there, and also perhaps learn how to help each other.
Mhm. Now, after the rapprochement, if it happens, do you think Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries will have an opinion or a say on the continuous Israeli strikes on Syria, which is happening now almost on daily basis?
Yeah, so I think that's a tough one because as you know, as we see, it's been happening on a daily basis. Then you've got the Abraham Accords in the background, especially with the UAE, and there was some talk. And can the UAE especially use their special relationship with Damascus and Tel Aviv to bring some kind of rapprochement between Syria and Israel, or at least lessen the missile attacks? And again, the big question mark there is Israel and Iran. We see a lot of these attacks, if not all of them, almost 100% are target against Iran. Of course, in the end, it's Syrian sovereign territory, and Syrians also suffer material loss from these missiles, especially to the airport or the Syrian soldiers. And I think that elephant in the room remains Iran. And if the Saudi desire is to talk to Iran, this could potentially put pressure on Israel to reduce their attacks. And I think we've seen, even in Israeli media and the Israeli commentary, there is a bit of nervousness about the Saudi-Iran rapprochement because this challenges Israel's one-sided attacks against Iran. So I think the Iran-Israel dynamics are very important when we look at the strikes in Syria. And if the Arabs are going to negotiate peace with Iran, with the Saudis leading, actually the Syrians could play a part in it. The Syrians historically have played a part in bringing Gulf countries and Iran on the negotiating table, even after the Iran-Iraq war, but also in the various times, former King of Saudi, Abdullah as well, Damascus played a part in the talks. So I think throughout the 30, 40-year history of Syria-Iran relations, Damascus has been able to use its special relationship to bridge the Gulf. So there could be some kind of help the Syrians could give because no one understands Iran better than the Syrian president. So in that sense, the Syrian president could help MBS and other Gulf leaders reduce tensions with Iran. That could have an impact on the missiles reigning in Damascus and
But as you
Riyadh.
mentioned, the Israeli side, I also follow the Israeli media, and the influencers on social media platforms aren't really happy with this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, do you expect, and also they aren't happy that the rapprochement is happening in the region also with Syria. Do you expect Netanyahu may escalate in Syria in order to tarnish this reconciliation between Damascus and the rest of the Arab world?
I think so. A lot of this, it doesn't play well into the policy, especially in terms of the antagonism towards Iran. That, of course, Israel has been threatening to attack Iran for many years. And also in America, as we see, a lot of the American commentators are dismissing the Chinese led, saying, oh, this is never going to happen. I think because obviously once you're locked out of the region, I'm not saying America is locked out of the region, it's still very much the military power, has troops in Syria, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq. So its presence is still very powerful. However, they cannot fathom an Iran-Saudi rapprochement, perhaps, and the same with Israel. Because if you look at the people who make policy, it's very much a policy of confrontation, it was Sunni versus Shia. It's Iran versus Saudi Arabia. Then it was Saudi Arabia versus Qatar. Even if you look at the commentary in Washington and Israel between the Qatar and Saudi blockade, and then MBS dropped everything, and now with various meetings between the Emir of Qatar and the Saudi leadership, all of a sudden these people were not comfortable because the
Mm,
policy of confrontation works. This is what keeps the jobs in the think tanks. It helps the defense companies. And unfortunately, this is the brute reality. And this is no matter what people say. When President Trump came in, he said, well, what are we achieving in all these wars? And that's why you saw a lot of the establishment jump against President Trump. He certainly was no Democrat or left liberal president. Everyone knows that. Yet there is a growing body of people in the US that think that this kind of military wars don't help. But certainly in the mainstream policy world, in Iran, Saudi rapprochement will
mm.
mean a loss of jobs because there's less conflict. And if you have no conflict, how do you keep your jobs and write these papers which justify all these wars?
Mhm. My last question would be about Lebanon. This rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran and
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia and Syria will definitely have its reflection on the Lebanese scene. And they, I don't know, it's been a year or a few months already, they don't have a president. And we know that the parliament in Lebanon chooses the president. And there is always a rift in Lebanon when it comes to election. It needs a regional agreement on a personality to lead the country. Although the president doesn't have a big authorities in Lebanon, he has to be Christian, he has to be Maronite. Now, definitely Jabban Basili is not going to be president. Samir Jaja is not going to be president. Who is the perfect nominee for this job, in your opinion, for Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Syria?
Yeah, that's a good question. Lebanon hasn't had a functioning government for a while now. They're going even before 1 year. I think yeah, it's a tough one. The name of Frangia pops up. Sleman Frangia, he could be a potential candidate. We also saw Shamoun, the granddaughter of the former president, throw her hat in the ring, and she's of course very much on the other side of Jaja. The Saudis wanted Jaja in the beginning, but I think the Saudis washed their hands off Lebanon. If we look at the Saudi policy in Lebanon over the last 3-4 years, and again, a young leadership in Saudi, Mohammed bin Salman was not interested in giving free handouts to many countries, whether it's their traditional allies like Egypt as well. And Hariri had failed the Saudis. So in that sense, the Saudis need a new policy in Lebanon. So it's not just about who the president is, but I think the balance of the cabinets. And in this sense, and I think I've mentioned this quite often, that this is where the Syria factor becomes very important. And throughout the last, 20, 30 years, with the Saudi relationship with Damascus and Beirut, with the Taif agreement as well, after the Hariri assassination, when King Abdullah went back to Damascus, Saudis need Damascus to stabilize Beirut.
Mm,
Uh, and unlike Iran, who perhaps just have one card in Lebanon, which is Hezbollah, Syrians have many different cards and many different allies, various Christian factions. They have Amal and they have various Sunni families historically that the Syrians have supported for prime minister as well. So in this sense, I would think Frangieh would be a perfect candidate, or Shamoun, but she was, she has lived most of her life outside Lebanon. But I certainly do not think Jaja would be someone who would be welcome. Most of half the Christians of Lebanon wouldn't accept Jaja, even if the Saudis want him. I think, and in this sense, it's a historic role Damascus has played, and people forget. And this is one of the reasons Syria, despite all the problems it has kept an influence in the region. It can still be a major player in Lebanese politics to balance out one party against the other. And the
For
Saudis need
those,
that. And I think that that's
yeah.
a big importance of the Saudis going back into Syrian relationship as well.
For those who don't know, guys, Frangieh is also a personal friend of Bashar Assad. There is family relationship between them and family visits. Let's see how this will end up for Lebanon and for Syria. But until then, Kamal Alam, thank you very much for being my guest. You're an expert in
Thank you.
contemporary military history of the Middle East. It was a pleasure talking with you. And also, your insights are very important also for me and for the audience of Syriana Analysis. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.